If you've seen my other Star Ocean videos, this one needs no introduction. If you haven't, well, it's been a rocky relationship to say the least. Back when the PS4 came out, I was saying the exact same thing that I'm now saying about the PS5. What's the bloody point? The previous game, Integrity and Faithlessness, was the first game I played on the PS4, and was without a doubt one of the worst games I've ever played. But with games like Star Oceans 3 and 4 remaining some of my favourites to this day, there was still hope that Square Enix could put at least a little bit of effort in to make this game a good one. I'm going to leave no stone unturned as we venture into the next generation of JRPG. Star Ocean: The Divine Force is a lot more open than previous games in its exploration. Many areas are sprawling and a lot more verticality has also been added. Cliffs, floating platforms, ruined columns or giant tree roots can all be scaled using Doomer, your spherical robot companion, that launches the character you control in almost any direction you choose. Although this could have easily been a welcome addition to the franchise and created interesting opportunities for exploring a well-crafted world with an equally well-crafted game mechanic, the movement has no weight to it whatsoever, and characters often get stuck or glitch out on the scenery. There are purple crystals scattered around everywhere, which give the player something to collect at least. These upgrade Doomer in and out of combat, but you will mainly find yourself running for extended periods of time through an extremely samey and uninteresting series of disjointed open maps. Thank God there is fast travel in this game, because the ever-present quest marker will have you backtracking from town to town constantly to have 5-second conversations of no consequence whatsoever, and then send you off again to another town that you've already visited several times. Very rarely will you have been through an area and find that there are new enemies or interesting changes that might make this backtracking bearable. Treasure chests are extremely easy to find, as you can use Doomer to scan for them, but also in the more tight corridor-like areas, you can see where treasure is likely to be, because it's often in a dead end along a branching path. So that's 3 different ways that the game makes finding treasure an absolute breeze. Not that you'd find anything much interesting normally anyway, because it's usually just standard consumable items. Once in a town, if you were thinking you could have some interesting conversations with characters and ask around for info on your next objective, as is honoured RPG tradition, you'll be sorely disappointed. The private actions of previous games are bafflingly absent, though it's not that the system is not included in the game, it's that I couldn't actually find any to do in my playthrough. I'm not saying these should be obvious, although even that would be an improvement, but surely an average person playing the game would come across some of these naturally. The only characters you can really talk to are those that give out the game's side quests. These do not deviate from what we've come to expect from Star Ocean, each one being a fetch quest to bring back a key item or a certain number of monster loot. Again, you'll not find much interesting here in terms of reward, and just like its predecessor, Integrity and Faithlessness, I think it's mainly due to the game being laughably easy. When you can breeze through the game, barely going into the skill tree to upgrade your characters, or forgetting that you just got a new weapon because you're already utterly destroying groups of enemies in 10 seconds flat, there's not much reason to seek the rewards of these side quests. The main meat of the gameplay is of course the combat, and Divine Force is at the very least more enjoyable here than Integrity and Faithlessness, though perhaps still just as shallow. Your spherical companion Doomer can create a shield around you and launch you at enemies. If you hold left or right whilst doing this move, chances are you'll blindside one or more enemies, stunning them and allowing you to do increased damage. Once you get the hang of the awkward, floaty controls, this is both a blessing and a curse. It's kind of fun zipping back and forth between enemies, but it also makes the player-controlled character an absolute powerhouse that can barely be touched by most enemies in the game. The only time things got a little tough was when bigger enemies started doing 1 or 2 hit kills on the rest of the party, but the trick sometimes was, instead of trying to revive them with an item and risk getting hit yourself, just continue to fight and the enemy will likely not be able to touch you. Once the fight is over, your teammates come back with 1 HP, continue to the next fight and ignore the fact that they will die immediately, because the majority of the game can be played like this. I even fought a boss battle this way, and the passive skill auto heal was healing me faster than the boss could do damage at skill level 1. Other than flying around with Doomer, each character of course has their own arsenal of skills which can be ordered to your liking in chain combos assigned to square, triangle or circle. MP has been done away with, and in its place there's a stamina bar which drains quickly but also fills quickly once you stop attacking. The more you blindside, the more the maximum stamina you can have, allowing you to do longer combo chains, and this is not lost upon switching characters mid-fight. To understand why the absence of MP use for skills and magic is actually a huge detriment to this combat system, we have to compare it to the excellent combat of Star Oceans 3 and 4. In 3, if a character's MP was reduced to 0, they would be incapacitated. Using skills also drains your HP at the same time, so using all your most powerful skills all the time was extremely risky. If an enemy could inflict damage to your MP, the entire party could be wiped out in a flash. This is one of the reasons why Star Ocean 3 is the most difficult in the series. However, it also allowed you to do MP damage to enemies, and if you paid attention to its systems, you could formulate amazing strategies in taking out the insanely tough super bosses in its optional final dungeon. Blindsides were introduced in Star Ocean 4, and also the rush gauge, which when full allowed you to do increased damage for a certain amount of time. To do decent damage, you wanted to utilise both of these and expend as much MP as you could in that limited window where you activate your rush gauge and blindside the enemy. So it was no longer risky to use all your MP, but you had to use it in the right way at the right time to maximise its effectiveness. In Star Ocean The Divine Force, you can blindside enemies far easier and spam your most powerful attacks whenever you like until the stamina gauge runs out. Wait a measly 2 seconds for it to fill again and continue spamming your most powerful attacks. Even if you're playing risky and wailing on an enemy that hasn't been blindsided, the player isn't really punished sufficiently, as the standard dodge can easily get you away from the enemy long enough to blindside them again. Long story short, the blindsides are insanely overpowered in this game, and there is no real reason to think about what you're doing or formulate different strategies to take enemies down. Because of this, the majority of the characters play extremely similarly, so whilst in my Star Ocean 4 review I covered most of the characters individually and how they drastically change your playstyle when using them, there is no reason to do that here. There are no light and heavy attacks, only chain combos that you build out of any of that character's skills that you choose, yet the game still suffers from repetitive, shallow combat. The only variation I can touch on in the standard character setup is some moves have more range, but when you have a mechanic that can launch you across the battlefield with the touch of a button, it's hardly something that requires much thought. There are a couple of characters which deserve a specific mention though. Nina is a 100% support character, something which we haven't had before in the series. She runs around giving area of effect buffs, healing, or moving players or enemies around by either bashing or teleporting them. Again, moving characters around seems a bit redundant when you have such a huge range of movement in Divine Force, but I do like the idea of having a support only character, and it can make for some interesting strategies. For instance, you could activate Nina's heal, which also heals over time, and switch to the character you want to heal, then move them into the area of effect. In the end, however, actually playing as Nina is just such an incredibly tedious and slow way to play the game, because you can't rely on the AI to deal damage at anywhere near the rate that you would if you were controlling an offensive character. The other noteworthy addition is Midas, who is a fully magic focused character. Rather than just standing there waiting to cast, he can continue charging whilst performing blindsides, which in theory sounds pretty fun, except it just doesn't feel satisfying. More often than not, you will charge towards an enemy to blindside them, your magic attack will charge, and then you're firing off a spell that will whiz past its intended target, as it was designed to be used at range. The casting of single spells does not lend itself to having a customizable chain combo, and choosing spells from the menu to suit each scenario is cumbersome. It wasn't really an issue in the other Star Oceans, as the magic users also had regular skills to use, with the magic being more powerful if used at the right time. So Magus as a 100% magic character is another good idea that fails to play into any good game design choices. Aside from this, item creation of course makes a return. However, as I mentioned previously, none of this feels like something that would help you overcome the already pitifully easy enemies the game throws at you. It's also a lot less satisfying a system this time round, as you kind of just throw random items together, and depending on the skill level of your character, this will affect the outcome of the creation. This completely de-incentivizes item creation until you've maxed out your character's creation skills, because unlike Star Ocean 4, where recipes would be unlocked as your characters grow to be crafted at your leisure, this means you never know what you're going to get, or if you just wasted your items. It also takes the fun out of searching for ingredients you know you need for a specific recipe. The flaws were so immediately apparent here that I barely touched item creation, as I felt it was yet another waste of time. The first thing to note about the story is the player's choice between Letitia and Raymond, the two main characters of the game. During certain scenes, the party will split up into two groups usually, and the player will stay with the character they chose, whilst the other character goes off and does something completely random. Almost every instance of this fails to give the game a legitimate reason to have this choice in the first place. One character will say things like, "I wonder why Raymond left so suddenly," and then that'll be the extent of the scene really, rather than using the opportunity to build chemistry between the character you chose and the rest of the party. I mention this first because you'll notice this as a common thread throughout my story breakdown. The game seems absolutely obsessed with creating these opportunities for the party to split up, sometimes seemingly for no reason at all, only to have the characters that you stay with discuss absolutely nothing of consequence. Tri-Ace obviously thought players would want to replay the game to see these extra scenes, but to do that they had to give us something of worth in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is Star Ocean: The Divine Force actually about? Usually by the end of an introductory sequence of a piece of media, you would have a grasp on what the story is about. However, this would not become even slightly apparent until hours and hours into the game. I mentioned when I played through the demo that the worst possible way you could open a game is by dumping you into an ongoing situation with no context whatsoever. I had a feeling that this is how the game would begin, and I was right. Raymond and his crew are in the middle of a space battle with a Federation ship, for reasons unknown to us. And on the planet below, Princess Letitia and her aide Albert have snuck out of the capital to do something. Raymond launches in an escape pod and lands right near the campsite, and thus the two main characters meet. This scenario can easily be compared to my favourite JRPG of all time, Dragon Quest VIII. You have several characters already on a quest, they are camping out on their way to a specific destination, and you get a quick introduction with them talking amongst themselves, then a fight to introduce you to the combat. However, in Dragon Quest, the characters then arrive in town and discuss exactly what it is they're doing there and the goal of their quest. No such scene occurs in the Divine Force. With each new member that joins the team, it becomes increasingly frustrating that characters will appear, say barely anything of substance, and then you're expecting the conversation to continue, and then all the characters just say, "Right then, let's go to the town of Rapunzel," and then they just go, and that's the game. In the opening hour, they also have the extremely overused trope where Albert doesn't trust Raymond and doesn't want anyone to get involved in their quest because he's overprotective of the princess, but this is almost immediately dropped and no real conflict arises. This alludes to possibly the biggest downfall of Star Ocean: The Divine Force, that the characters have absolutely zero chemistry. You see, I can take or leave the storylines in the other Star Ocean games. They aren't fantastic. Even the very similar Tales of series doesn't really have much memorable going for it in terms of the story, but the characters all have major chemistry in Star Oceans 1 through 4, and even more so in the Tales of games. Characters are constantly interacting with each other about any topic imaginable, whether it's a serious conversation about a character's past, or a quirky one about cooking, or who's the cutest. These characters need to ooze personality, otherwise not only do you have a story that nobody will care about, but characters doing and saying things that nobody cares about in a shit game that nobody cares about. Anyway, on with my laboriously detailed review of said game. The camera starts doing this weird thing where it looks at Albert's arm during cutscenes. I actually thought it was other characters looking at his frilly sash thing that he has hanging there, but apparently this was to show that he has a glove on one hand. This isn't just a character design quirk. Apparently Albert has a magical prosthetic hand, and not the cool kind that's good for making devils cry. Albert is also sick, although it's not clear whether these two things are related. This all comes up randomly as a huge part of the main quest, which conveniently involves finding Midas, the same person the characters were looking for anyway. This information about why Letitia left her city on her quest comes well over an hour into the game, by the way, and even here the characters just continue talking in vague terms and ask no questions of each other that any normal person would ask. Questions like, why do they need to find Midas so bad? Why isn't there anyone out looking for the missing princess? What was Raymond's mission on his ship? Why is he not part of the Galactic Federation? Why was the Federation attacking his ship? Why have the Federation just left when they clearly would have known the escape pods were launched? A couple of these questions are answered, if at all, more than 6 hours into the game. So the party goes to ask a doctor who worked with Midas about his whereabouts, at which point he explicitly states that he would give the characters this information if their motivations were pure. The characters have no answer to this, and instead stand there in utter bemusement before saying, "Well, I guess something will come up then," and leaving. It's here that Nina joins the party on the promise that they will end up at the capital where she can study her healing. However, this is not where the party is headed. She has no real reason to go find Midas any more than she did before, when she could have easily found out where he was and gone herself. After a trip to a nearby town for another doctor to give a second opinion on Albert's arm and or mystery illness, the player then backtracks to the initial doctor again, who decides that actually he will now reveal the whereabouts of Midas, despite nothing really changing and the characters still not revealing anything about their motivations. For all he knows, the main characters are a band of hardened assassins out to kill Midas because he slated the royal family or something. Hell, at this point, that could actually be the case and the player would be none the wiser. So it's off to Midas's village, heavily guarded with magical machines of his making, which attack the party without provocation. It's okay though, Midas then lets them straight in to treat Albert. Rather than having a boss fight and Midas say, "Whoops, I guess you're not an enemy," would it not have been better to have the characters prove themselves in some way? Further to still having no clue what the characters are trying to achieve, Letitia then states outright that whatever that was, making a new prosthetic arm for Albert is now far more important. She implores Midas to help them. Despite everyone agreeing that Midas is a very busy man that his village relies upon greatly, once again he decides to join the party just because he feels like it, I guess. Even despite making it known that the rest of the characters being there is a complete inconvenience to him. The only reason that is vaguely alluded to is his interest in Duma, the spherical robot that's been following them around and been of no consequence to the plot whatsoever thus far. The characters mention worries that Duma will draw too much attention. The princess is on a covert mission after all, but this is hand-waved away by Letitia in one line, saying that Duma resembles the floating orbs that semiomancers have with them. Raymond's response to this is, okay, and then the characters continue on their journey. Imagine if in Final Fantasy X, Tidus, upon arriving on Besaid Island, heard about this character Yuna, who's a summoner. Instead of saying, "What is a summoner?" just said, "Okay, let's everyone head to Luca now." That is how poor the writing is in Star Ocean: The Divine Force. A character is told about an important aspect of the world's lore and has no reaction whatsoever, and as a result, we the player are left with nothing to latch onto and no reason to care. Once Midas finishes his examination, the characters exit his house and clearly see Elena's escape pod crashing far to the east in these mountains. Then the characters take an extremely short trip in the opposite direction between a crevice in the mountain adjoining the village and find the landing pod there where it would have been impossible to land judging by the prior scene 60 seconds ago. What follows is the most insane backtracking section, I think, since Devil May Cry 4. The player returns to the start of the game to fetch parts from Ray's escape pod. Then the party splits up, with half going back to fix Elena, who it's revealed is an android, so that's why the parts were needed, and the other half revisiting every town that's already been visited to ask about sightings of Chloe's escape pod, something which could have already been asked about when they were there initially. This adds nothing to the plot and only serves to pad out the game's length. The split party meet back up again at Elena's escape pod, where Ray speaks to Letitia about being tired, and Elena joins the party without a single word spoken in introduction to the rest of the characters that she just met. This happens again when the characters later meet Chloe, who upon being released from jail just stands there as part of the team, almost like a placeholder asset. The characters backtrack yet again to a previously visited town where the plot is jarringly sidetracked by a bird crapping on Midas. The player's task is then to collect bird poo from around the town for Elena to analyse back at the inn. I'm not even joking. It is there that the player will finally get a tiny speck of what can possibly constitute a plot. Off-worlders have manufactured a plague and are testing it out on the people of this planet. But at this point, what is there that could possibly be salvaged from the diabolical writing and delivery of this threadbare mess? The rest of the game sees the party constructing a technologically advanced weapon to counter the help that another neighbouring empire are receiving from these off-worlders. Despite the obvious and logical outcome that the Galactic Federation would have known all this was going on after attacking Ray's ship at the beginning of the game and intervened, this story remains tied to this one planet, and no sci-fi elements find their way into this supposedly sci-fi setting. The Galactic Federation, arguably the most important group in Star Ocean lore, are nowhere to be found in this game. The story, characters, setting, world building, everything about it is utterly broken at its very core. This is demonstrably and without a doubt some of the laziest writing ever conceived. Most people would find this obvious, but as I've seen many posts online from people praising the story and characters, it seems we have to go deeper. At the risk of sounding pretentious, to fully explain how bad this story is, we can look at film theory, which 100% applies to games as well. If you study even the basics of film, or have seen the Mr. Plinkett Star Wars reviews, you will know that it's generally a good idea to stick to even a basic tried and true formula, then build from there. Each scene in a good movie is constructed of beats which move an overall plot along and contribute to character building up to the conclusion of one or more arcs, where you see a fundamental shift. A character learns something, makes a change, and perhaps the tone of the story changes as the audience grows and learns with our character. An excellent video from the channel Studio Binder explains this all in great detail, and I highly suggest anyone watch it if you want to better understand what makes writing good or bad objectively. Because yes, this Star Ocean story is objectively bad. If you watch the video How to Write Great Scenes with this game fresh in your mind like I did, then you will understand how the Divine Force lacks basically any element that makes up a coherent story, let alone a great one. And this isn't some no-budget indie developer, this is Square Enix. There were people paid to write this garbage. Well, presumably, it could have been a few unpaid interns that were then not given a permanent position at the company. I had to giggle as I saw that Star Ocean The Divine Force had an option to prioritise frame rate or graphics. I knew such an option would probably make no difference whatsoever. Japanese games have generally been trending downwards in both graphical fidelity and optimization, due possibly to old developers heading up companies, such as Square Enix, refusing to retire as they all collectively forget all of the things that made their games great in the 90s to early 2000s. Needless to say, the Divine Force looks incredibly dated and also runs abysmally, regardless of the graphical options you choose. Any fun that can be had from the combat is quickly drained away by the terrible optimization. Initiating a surprise attack, for instance, you won't get to see any of that play out in real time, only see a message frozen on the screen as the frame rate plummets to 2 FPS. Then find your character in a completely different place once the game catches up with your plans. The world design lacks inspiration and at times appears hastily put together or simply copied and pasted. Take the castle in the capital city as an example. Its only notable feature is its size, making it tedious to navigate. Adding some asymmetry here would have given it character, but it seems that would have been too much effort. The overall plasticky look to the buildings and characters does not play well with this design choice either. It means that most areas you visit lack character. They all meld into one in the player's mind. Each area of the world takes on a different theme, kind of an archaic concept now. There's a forest temple, autumn plains, thick jungle, etc. They all look markedly better than the previous game due to some improved lighting, though still not quite as good as Star Ocean 4 somehow. Integrity and Faithlessness was a PS4 game that looked like a PS2 game. This is a PS5 game that looks like a PS3 game. Perhaps when the PS6 comes out, Japanese RPGs will start to look good again. Despite the improved lighting, the game struggles to render grass and shadows at a painfully small distance. The small amount of water in the game looks laughably bad, though probably my main issue is not purely visuals, but how the world was constructed. Upon leaving one area and entering another, literally no attempt was made to create a transition. You can be in a muddy swamp at dusk surrounded by green and brown 1 second, then after a loading screen, in the middle of a blizzard surrounded by mountains in the middle of the day. I complained that Star Ocean 5 also had jarring level design that allowed for obvious circular combat arenas rather than having the monsters be roaming the world in a natural way. The more open areas of the Divine Force go some way to rectifying this immersion breaking flaw. However, they do introduce some problems of their own. most enemies still stand around in formation, as if they were minding their own business, hanging around in a classic SNES RPG, and suddenly, boom. Sorry mate, it's 2022, you're in Star Ocean 6 now, but don't worry, someone will still come along and fight you. Enemy designs themselves vary wildly in production values. A lot of staple Star Ocean enemies are here, with some new additions. These mainly come in the form of larger foes such as giant toads or trolls, and they generally have these enemies just standing around in one place looking utterly gormless. Not the imposing threat that they should have been, like the big enemies in Final Fantasy XII were, for instance. Those enemies would sometimes eat the smaller ones. Again, a PS2 game from almost 2 decades ago, effortlessly world building in a way that this game could only dream of on PS5. Okay, so let's talk about character design. Despite the concept art generally being really beautiful, the main character Raymond is perhaps the most bafflingly goofy looking character we've had in a JRPG for a long time. His hair looks like a Lego piece, he has an insanely buff physique with a neck like a tree trunk, but a tiny little pointy face. Letitia and Albert are definitely easier on the eyes, but they're also giving me some serious deja vu from other JRPGs. I'm pretty sure if I booted up Soul Calibur 3's absolutely off the wall character creator, I could make Midas and Welsh no problem. As for the other characters, they're decent, but they're not exactly the kind of characters that will stick with you for years to come. I mean, they're no Bacchus from Star Ocean 4. Also true to modern JRPG form, the UI and menus are a nightmare to navigate. They can be overwhelming and confusing, making it a challenge to find the necessary options and information, but also doing simple things like using healing items from this menu must be done painstakingly, one at a time. Despite the lock-on reticle being huge and distracting, when you actually lock on to enemies, the camera doesn't follow them. In a game where the main mechanic is to fly all over the place blindsiding enemies, a fully manual camera seems like a blatantly awful idea, but the developers obviously had no clue. The best thing about the previous Star Ocean was undoubtedly the soundtrack, though very few tracks were actually original compositions, the majority of which being lifted wholesale from Star Oceans 3 and 4. Though I could never accuse Motoi Sakuraba of being lazy, the man has produced more soundtracks than I've had people shout baldy at me from the window of a white van, and that's a lot. I am, however, pleased to hear that he has contributed far more original tracks for this entry. Though unfortunately the first piece we hear in the opening montage is a pathetically lame J-pop song they clearly put in as a marketing gimmick. A lot of JRPGs have J-pop acts doing the opening theme song nowadays, and it's definitely a good way of bringing two fan bases together. However, when the track goes so completely counter to the tone of every other Star Ocean game and their opening music tracks, you have to wonder, is it really worth it? The main menu theme is possibly Sakuraba's best effort yet, hitting on the epic space adventure vibes with all the optimism of the previous versions of the theme. I love, however, that after the first motif kicks in, there's a slight dip into a more eerie and mysterious tone before hitting back. For some tracks, their epic adventure vibes are far from earned, however, though this is by no means the fault of the music. The track that accompanies the first cutscene, for instance, eye-rollingly titled Ray of Hope, is 57 seconds of lovingly crafted cinematic orchestral bliss. Starting off with an ambient drone accompanied by a twinkling of glockenspiel and harp, probably meant to anthropomorphise the Star Ocean we see, then rolling into pounding bass drums, fluttering woodwinds, and a strong brass melody as we see Ray's escape pod crash to the surface. A fantastic way to start things off, but a complete shame that it accompanies such bland storytelling. Some tracks do, however, go too far, with too much texture and masking, almost verging on white noise at times. These are meant to accompany the really desperate situations in the game, and it has always been a stylistic choice of Sakuraba's to make these tracks very busy and dissonant. Busy textures and masking do however extend to some of the tracks that usually have a lot more impact in the game. To be more precise, the various battle themes. Dance of the White Blade, for example, for its main melodies has brass and strings with low attack, which sets them into the background a touch too much. Compare this with the previous games, which had electric guitar and saw synths blasting out much more defined melodies, and I think it's fairly obvious which ones are more likely to get you humming along. Overall, I actually think this may be one of Motoi Sakuraba's best soundtracks, due mainly to the fact it feels like he's trying to guide the player through a range of emotional beats throughout certain tracks, rather than his tracks simply being set dressing for the various areas of the game, as was the case in previous entries. Having said that, a lot of the tracks are short one-off pieces, none of which are particularly memorable or stand out to me as a piece that really knocked it out of the park. It's only that I find very little to fault with the compositions themselves, considering what it was that the composer had to work with. On the audio side of things, more issues that were fixed from the previous game, though that's not exactly deserving of a medal. The characters no longer all shout their victory phrases at the same time after every single battle. Generally, it's hard to comment on the voice acting beyond the technical with a script this abysmal though. It's about the quality you would expect from a bog standard anime JRPG. Perpetually shrill women and men who sound like they've just dumped a bucket of gravel down their throat. Star Ocean's iconic menu sounds have been a staple since the very first game, and that's not set to change here. The sound design in battle is generally surprisingly good considering the poor production values elsewhere, but let's face it, I'm sure corners were cut and assets were reused from other games. Again, there's nothing here that sticks out as particularly groundbreaking. So, was it worth bringing back Star Ocean one more time after the disaster that was the 5th entry? Well, Square Enix have been very coy with sales details of Integrity and Faithlessness, as they have with the ongoing sales of the Divine Force. Bayonetta 3 released around the same time as Star Ocean 6, and Nintendo were happy to share when that reached 1 million sales, so I doubt Square Enix have much to say on the matter. In terms of the quality of the game itself, it's clear for anyone to see the low effort put into it by one of the richest, most successful Japanese games companies of all time. Fans of the series will make excuses, saying this is a niche title, and if only the last one sold well, they'd have given the series a bigger budget. If you ask me, there is no excuse. This game is dreadful, and although a whole lot better than the last game, should have never been made. Almost every aspect of the game includes poor design choices from supposed professional developers, and I don't care how big a fan you are of the series, you're completely delusional if you think this is acceptable on PS5. Once again, I see people posting in online forums with the mindset that more is better regardless of quality, but from my perspective, all I have to show from the Divine Force is a void of wasted time, and this, the most in-depth review you're ever likely to see on the game. I've been Jake of the Retro Perspective, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.